week, I want to wrap up our Easter series with a final message on what it means to walk the road with Jesus in these liminal times, the in-between times. The time between the resurrection of Christ, where we see the first fruits, and the waiting to see Jesus conquer death and all things and celebrated as Lord of all, which we celebrate on Ascension Sunday in May the 29th. So we are looking forward to the triumphant return of Christ to set all things right. And what that means is we are each in the here and now kind of stumbling forward, anxiously awaiting something better, but at times confused about what presently is, needing hope and faith to journey forward well in these days. Now, I hope you don't mind a deep dive into the church calendar, but I thought it might be timely at the moment. So if you're from the low church tradition like me, you might be wondering, why are we finishing an Easter series today? Isn't Easter already done? Didn't we have the Easter Sunday and then you get a great bank holiday? Isn't that awesome? But actually, this is the second Sunday in Easter of 7. Easter continues on. The reason why we have the 7 there, and it culminates in Pentecost with the birth of the church, the coming of the Spirit. And that's because the resurrection isn't simply an event that's a one-off in the past. Actually, the resurrection is something every time we gather on Sunday, we do so on Sunday to remember the resurrection. That's part of the whole church tradition. It's to say that the resurrection marks a point in history where everything has changed. And this affects, we celebrate it on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, we walk out the implications of the resurrection. In the way that we work, in the way that we socialize, in our rest and our play, and even our exercise and our walking. Now, if I was to be really strict to the church calendar, then today is actually, as the Eastern Church would call it, Thomas Sunday. And this is when we remember doubting Thomas, who brought his questions to Jesus, who, rather graphically there, probed his wounds and became the first one to testify in the fullness that Jesus is not just a private Savior, but He is Lord of all. And it's beautifully captured in my second favorite Caravaggio painting here. And this is part of Easter too, that we all have our doubts, we have our struggles, right? And that we need revelation to move forward, to journey through the pain, through the Sacred Heart of Christ, into life to the full. And that is part of Easter as well. But today I want to wrap up the series with what actually the church globally celebrated on Monday, Monday just gone. And it's called Emmaus Monday or Emmaus Day, and it celebrates this story from Luke 24 of the two disciples, Cleopas and companion, journeying to Emmaus. You might remember the story where they're disenchanted. They're leaving Jerusalem, they're heading 7-mile journey, effectively the equivalent of going from Sea Green via the Beaconsfield School over to the High Wycombe Lido. So imagine kind of a 3-hour wander together with Jesus. And He comes alongside them, opens their eyes, eats with them, their hearts burn, and then they're sent back with good news to tell. That's the story. And how did they go from disenchanted to on fire with Jesus? How did Jesus journey alongside? And that's what we're going to be looking at in this. But this is my favorite Caravaggio painting. And if you've ever been to the National Gallery, this is in there, unless it's on loan to Northern Ireland, as it was the last time I was there, and I was bitterly disappointed. I love our neighbours, but I was cursing that the painting was away, because this is my favorite painting ever. So what I'm going to do is just give us a minute. As you take a minute, I want you to look at this painting and see what stands out to you. And then at the end of the minute, I'll give you one more minute just to turn to a neighbour. So don't be solos here, because there's going to be a few discussion points on the way through. Turn to a neighbour and just tell them one thing that stands out to you in this painting. Is that cool? All right, go for it. Take a minute now. Okay, if you want to hold your conversation there, this is a great piece. My late mentor, Dr. Lindsay Farrell, who was an art lecturer at the Australian Catholic University, this was one of his favourite paintings too, and he could spend hours talking about this piece, and we'd walk some of the Camino Way with Lindsay and his wife, Anne. I just want to point out a couple of things. One is, you notice the elbow patches on the disciple pulling away from the table and yet advancing at the same time. So there's kind of a retreat but also an advance. And that's captured by the art on the edge of the table about to fall off. It's a precipitous moment. I think it's one of the first times that you see blurring in a painting to show dynamism in the moment of his arms being flung back. It's quite cool. But two things that might stand out. This one you probably didn't pick, but it is a bit of a spoiler. You'd need it real big in the National Gallery to see this. But the shadow on the table under Jesus' hand, it doesn't show up here, but there's actually on the shadow, you can't see it anywhere else, a little spot of white in the middle of it. That's the stunning part of this painting, right in the center, that actually the light coming through at the point of offering the Eucharist effectively in a hotel or a house, that the light shines through the scars in Jesus' hand and seen. And so the shock at that moment is this is the resurrected Christ. He came alongside, but wow. And you see the light on the table coming through the pierced hand. It's beautiful, beautiful piece. The other thing you might notice is the shell. Anyone notice that? Anyone see the shell there? Yeah, can you see the shell on the dude on the right? You can see it on his lapel. That's a shell. I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. And I'll put the pack up here, both as a prop and also just to make sure Alex takes it at the end. So, Alex, if you don't take your pack back, which I've used for the last couple of weeks, thank you very much. It's your responsibility now, okay? Cool. So, this story has birthed a tradition of Emmaus gang, of spiritual walks, of pilgrimages the world over. And the shell has been used as the international symbol for the pilgrim. On the road with Jesus is effectively what it says. And it brings together two concepts. One in the Hebrew, the word halakha, which basically means not just law, but to walk before God, to walk in the way of God. So if you think of Enoch, who walked with God all of his days and then was taken. Or if you think of the Latin concept of coram Deo, to live before the face of God. So it's this kind of concept of I live and walk before God who sees all things. So you might think of Moses in the wilderness for 40 years with the children of Israel. You might think of Jesus in the desert and then sending the disciples with packs, but very little in them, traveling light on the journey to bless people. You might think of the desert fathers and mothers purifying their lives as spiritual athletes to become holy through many trials. They were pilgrims, one and all. And the scallop shell there, which is beautiful, represents this perfectly. It's a symbol of protection. You think of a shell, of transformation, something growing inside. And actually on the Camino, all of the rivets there, basically the furrows point to one place, which is Santiago de Compostela. All the paths lead to the one destination. You might have seen this, for instance, on a baptismal font that's shaped like a scallop, or decorated with one. Or you might have seen a priest in a creed tradition that baptizes infants, that they use a scallop-shaped dish to baptize with. And it's also the symbol for Spain and the symbol for St. James, who used the scallop shell during his pilgrimage to beg. A big one was like a bowl for him. He would substitute as a plate to collect food as he wandered because he took nothing with him. And it was also used as a kind of dish or a glass, a cup to be able to scoop up water and to drink out of. So it's hard working out which James is which. There's three in the Bible, and it kind of throws you off a little bit. So it's not James the Just, it's not James the Lesser, it is James the Great. And after Jesus died, St. James got pretty busy. He was John's brother, the son of Zebedee. He was a fellow apostle, James the Great. And Jesus called the disciples to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And they took that pretty literally. Finisterre in the Spanish is what they would refer to as the end of the earth. And actually there is a place that you can walk to called Finisterre, which at that time they thought literally was the end of the earth on northwestern Spain. And so they drew lots, and St. James was given northwestern Spain, or Galicia as the locals would say. And so he basically headed off then, a picture that you've been sent to a place you don't really quite know where it is, and you've got 4,000 miles to go by boat and foot, carrying virtually nothing. That's what he did. He went from Jerusalem to Spain, preaching as he went, and he ended up establishing a church in northwestern Spain in Galicia. And that church grew, but then he had a vision around AD 40, as church tradition holds. He returned to Jerusalem, and you may know, sadly, he became the first martyr following Jesus. You could argue that was Stephen, but in terms of the early church. That was his lot. Now, later converts around 300 AD from that church, they said he was a real dude. We want to honor him. And so what they did is they took his bones all the way back from Jerusalem to Galicia, and they built a cathedral at this relic, which became Santiago de Compostela. Santiago, St. James de Compostela, composing. His bones are composing in this location. A bit gruesome. And that's basically where all the paths end. And the history of a particular route in the 9th century, sorry, church history lesson, 9th century, King Alfonso II, who had an awesome nickname, El Castro, he was a resident in the adjacent region of Asturias, which has very good soups, stews, and meats and cheese. If you ever go there and they pour the cider from a hide, it bubbles up. I can definitely recommend that. But El Castro left his royal domain, and he wanted to honor the life of James and the Jesus that James served. So he basically left his royal domain and began a pilgrimage in 813 AD to honor James, and that gave rise to what we call the primitive way, or the Camino Primitivo. And that's the oldest route. And effectively, it's got shells, scallops, marking the whole path, illuminating the path to follow. And that's why I was away this Easter. I really hope you don't mind a little bit of vicarious travel and a couple of photos, because I think I uploaded about 1,000 to Facebook. It was a little bit obsessive, so you might have seen some if you're connected in that way. But that's what I got prepared, is a little bit of a photo show before we jump into the passage. So I went with 6 dear friends across the Easter period, and Nikki joined us for the first 2 days as well. And we hiked the Camino Primitivo, a 200-mile trail from northern Spain in Oviedo, across to Asturias, from Asturias across to Galicia, and we went to Santiago de Compostela, where the bones of St. James are meant to be buried beneath the cathedral's altar in the crypt. And it was especially poignant. We got in there on Sunday, but then the next day, when we went to see the cathedral, we could hear the bells ringing every 20 seconds and try to work out what was going on, and discovered that Pope Francis, who was just buried yesterday, that he'd passed away. And in a center for Catholicism, it was very somber as the news spread of the Pope has passed away. And we're all wondering, what does this mean in this time in the world's history, which is very messy, with wars and rumors of wars, and who will they elect next, and Anglican Church electing a new Archbishop for Canterbury as well. It's an important time. All of us and the culture as a whole needs wisdom to journey forward. And all of our paths converged on Santiago, but as one of our hosts, Heidi, said, the real Camino starts when you reach Santiago. The real Camino is not getting to Santiago, it's living the rest of your life in light of the pilgrimage you've just done. It's resurrection hope. How do we live in light of this trek? And that's because discipleship is not simply a moment, but it's learning to follow the way of Jesus in your particular context, in your time and place. So what does that mean for us? Now, as our little posse of 6 gathered, we all desperately needed wisdom on the road to follow the way of Jesus. Each of us in various ways are in a liminal place between discouragement and challenge, looking back, and hopeful anticipation of a world set right as we look forward. There were people who are at career junctures after finishing a PhD. Bruce, that's the guy who brought us all together. He just finished his PhD and he's saying, what next? There were marriages that needed rebuilding after lost trust. There was new relationships forming of a guy whose spouse had passed away 5 years ago. There were questions of work and how to handle retirement. Some were grappling with ethical questions in the light of AI and how to do their work ethically, or how to not cheat at their studies or shortcut the hard yards to do things well. And all of us were stumbling onward, rejoicing. But what was really amazing in this journey, as we tried to follow Christ together, was that our little community of Christians became really attractive to other people along the way. It became a witness. And we ended up collecting a bunch of other pilgrims who wanted to share part of the journey with us. We had the most amazing conversations. And as we'd encounter someone, I'd ask the same question every time. What does the Camino, what does the way, that's what Camino means, what does the way mean to you? Very simple question. Is it a physical challenge? Is it an extreme exercise to know your limits, which it was? Or is it a space to be quiet and to discern? Are you at a juncture in your life? Is it spiritually significant? Is it religiously significant? I would just ask the question and these to open up. Full business point of view with a young adult kid. He was on the up and up, but then he had a stroke at the high point of his career. It ended his career. It made him soul search about what it was all about. He'd just come off the back of being at a funeral for his best mate's wife who died of cancer. And he was absolutely disenchanted. But he knew that his nominalism needed to go somewhere. And so he wanted to come on this walk to discipline his body to see if God may be there and want to speak to him. Really powerful. So we walked and we talked about suffering, about God's goodness in the struggle. Now, strangely but delightfully, it was very strange for our group of upper 40s to early 60s, 6 guys, that we ended up with 3 20-somethings who for some bizarre reason decided to join us from day 3 onwards and adjusted their schedules to stick with us until Santiago. It was quite strange, but it was fantastic. And that was really strange because in the West, a lot of young adults walk away from the church, not to the church. But there was something attractive about the conversations we're having. And they were needing a bigger vision of the gospel. None of them were Christian. They needed a reason to follow Jesus' way, a reason for being. So take Frederico and Sylvia. Still in touch with them. I was just contacting them this morning. They are 20-somethings Romanians. They're living in Oviedo at the moment on a student exchange with the Erasmus program. Sylvia studied medicine and worked for a year in that. Frederico does environmental engineering. They both worked for a short stint, but then found that they felt out of touch with themselves, with the modern work rhythms and the nature of their jobs. And they felt like they'd lost what mattered most. And they were both brought up in a really domineering Catholic religious family that was quite controlling and legalistic. And that junked the church. But now they strangely found themselves wondering what the point of life is as they see their country potentially invaded by Russia, was their fear, with changes of government at the moment, as has happened with Ukraine. And we walked and we talked about calling, about career, about what makes for a solid relationship as they discerned whether to part company or to move towards marriage in the next season. By the end of the time together, they said, we have a great relationship and we're excited. And Frederico decided he's going to propose to her in the next few months. That was just from conversations along the road. Or take Olivia. Olivia is a wonderful 24-year-old agnostic Aussie. And she comes from a severely broken family with mental health issues shot through. She's one of the most resilient people I've ever met, and she is allergic to gaslighting males. So she's seen some bad stuff. She's unsure what her gifts are, but she knows she's made for something more. We walked and we talked about security, about hope, flourishing, global tariffs, making ends meet, and we unpacked the meaning of life as she read the Bible and prayed with us, wondering if perhaps God might exist and where God's love might be in the mess. It's amazing. Pilgrims, one and all. So I want you each to take a minute of silence, and during this minute of silence, I want you to write something down, whether on your phone or on a piece of paper, but I do not want you to do the wonderful thing where you just sit there with your eyes shut, as though hopefully you're meditating on something, but you may not be. And so I'm going to do my teacher voice, which is, I want you to write something down. And here's what I want you to write something down. Imagine you had a 3-hour walk and talk with Jesus. What would you ask him? What is your Camino question for Jesus at this juncture in your life as you look back, as you look forward? Let's take a minute to do that now. Now, you may need some more time for that afterwards, but I think it's important to be able to clarify where we need the Lord to walk alongside us so that we might discern what's wise in this moment in our lives. Now, that may get the record for the longest introduction ever, but we're going to jump into the scriptures now. So if you have your Bibles, could you grab Luke 24, 13 to 36? And we're going to have a look at this Emmaus story. And we're going to keep referring to it on the way through. We're going to do some scripture engagement together, wrestle with it. And we're also going to relate this ancient passage to being on the road with Jesus today. And this picks up something that John Stott beautifully modeled, double listening, where we're listening carefully both to the ancient word and to the modern world in order to relate the one to the other with fidelity to what God said and sensitivity to the context in which we are. So that's what we're going to do. And this relates to something that I'll mention a little bit later, a resource from LICC called Reimagine, which we've just put out, which you may want to check out. Now, in a moment, I'm going to invite Susie up to read this passage, but I'm going to play a little bit of sound in the background, which may or may not work. We'll see how this goes. Let me just test it. Coming up, here we go. Let's see if you can hear this. Can you hear that? All right. I don't know if you can pick what that is, but it's actually, I literally downloaded an hour of walking on gravel. So I want you to imagine that we're walking with Jesus as we hear the reading, okay? And I'll keep this going during the reading. And there'll be some art that'll come up on the screen. I might turn it down a touch because it's annoying me, at least from where I am. We'll imagine that we're walking along with Jesus, and you don't need to read the passage while we're doing it. You can refer to that later, but there'll be some art on the screen. And I've chosen pictures of a male and a female walking together, because in the Bible it says Cleopas and companion, but in the Gospel of Luke and also in Acts it refers to Cleopas's wife. And it's a very legitimate interpretation that it's Cleopas and his wife who are wandering along. So I've chosen male and female pictures because I think oftentimes we overrepresent the masculine in our readings and we don't see women within the story. So again, they're walking from Jerusalem. They expected Christ was going to conquer everything and become the one who displaced the Romans. They were looking for a political savior. And then when Jesus dies at the hands of Rome, they're like, what on earth was this about? They're disenchanted, discouraged. They're walking back to what they knew. Perhaps some would even say Emmaus was a center for zealots, so they might have even been deciding to radicalize. We're not sure exactly what they were walking to, but they're walking away. Notice the way that Jesus comes alongside. And then he walks with them. They find a place, maybe their own house, maybe a hotel, and then they get sent back to Jerusalem. 2 questions. We're going to read the passage, then we'll have time to discuss this. First question, how do you identify with these disciples? So as you hear their story, in what sense do you feel a connection with them? In perhaps that disenchantment and walking away, or your heart's burning? I don't know. But how do you feel connected to them? Ancient word, modern world. Second question is, notice how Jesus comes alongside them to reimagine life. How does he help them go from disenchanted to finding wisdom for the way? Just one observation that stands out to you. Is that cool? All right, Susie, can you read for us?
Thanks. That same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them, but God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago." Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time, they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he were going on, but they begged him, "Stay the night with us, since it is getting late." So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" And within the hour they were on their way back to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them, who said, "The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter." Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said.
So I want you to take 30 seconds now, just in silence, to think about those questions, and then I'll give you just a couple of minutes with each other, and then I'll draw this into some principles on the way of how we walk with Jesus on the road. So let's take 30 seconds now to just reflect, and then I'll tell you when to share with each other. Silence first, though. Okay, if you want to hold your conversation there. This is such a rich story. I just want to weave a couple of thoughts, give a framework, and then we'll return to sung worship. There was a book written by this guy, David Smith, a very good missiologist, called Moving Toward Emmaus, Hope in a Time of Uncertainty. And he was pointing out that actually the whole culture, in a sense, is moving toward Emmaus at the moment. Our disenchantment with politics, our disenchantment with religious institutions, with family, with education, with almost every sphere of society has risen to high levels. Our lack of trust is evident everywhere. We see this breaking down the whole fabric of society, falling apart. And people are walking away saying, where do we go? It gives us a model of how we're fragmenting society. And we see this, thanks, Cheryl. My clicker died, so we're now going to be a little bit more direct here. But we see this, for instance, in Barna research, that 73% of young adults who grew up in the church by the time they enter the workforce have left the church. It's a radical statistic. And we do see some people coming back in Gen Z, but this is massive. If we go to the next slide. We see that people are facing doubts all over the place. Hypocrisy of religious people, science, questions of science, how faith relates to it, human suffering, conflict in the world. And what we really need is, next one, thanks. What we really need is a new way forward. We need a better conversation. We need a conversation that starts with one another's stories, that actually takes seriously and listens well to people's everyday lives, but then relates that to the Word of God. And then it helps them live their faith within a world that is complex and confusing. Call this triple listening to the Word, the world, and one another. Next slide, thanks. So we've been playing around with a way of doing this through some of the work at LICC, but I think this is a really helpful model for theological reflection and engagement. It's just got 4 parts to it, which we see in the story. And it's listen, imagine, create, communicate. Listen, imagine, create, communicate. The first thing, and I'm going to use Sylvia's story, who I said was in medicine and walked away from it as an example. So we listen. We start by Jesus coming alongside and being open to him asking us questions. We listen to what's going on and why in my particular time and place. That Sylvia basically thought she had a job and a calling, but then medicine didn't quite work out in the way she wanted. She loves to help people, but she hates feeling disconnected and just giving out medication and everything being so regimented. She hopes there's a way she could integrate normal medicine and alternative ways of health because she feels there's a better story around. That's, as we listened, what we noticed in her story, to her time and place. Next slide. But then we need to be open to imagine what should be going on as we locate our front line and our context within the big story of God's mission. As I listened to Sylvia, it became apparent that actually her story fits within God's story. That actually what she loves reflects shalom that God made us for, of right connection with God, neighbor, nature, self, not just taking a segment of reality, but all things woven together. And the brokenness reflects what God calls sin, that things aren't the way they should be, but then there's hope of restoration and a vision of everything working together. So she started to see her context within God's mission. Next slide. And that then leads us to a point of creating. You notice that, again, firstly, Jesus asks questions, then he tells them, the prophets, the story, he locates it within the mission, but then he eats with them. I love how he pretends is going further on because they've got to respond. They need to want this. You can't force it. So we'd chat, we'd leave a gap, and then see if she wanted to move forward or away, and it's a conversation. But with Jesus, he breaks bread with them, and then their hearts are open. And it was over meals that we discovered together how to respond to this cultural moment, how to seek shalom through spiritual practices and healing. That actually Sylvia found that some of the Ignatian practices that she didn't know of but were part of her lapsed Catholic faith, like the prayer of examen, was incredibly helpful to her because she was struggling with unforgiveness. and that was a way of processing it. And that she could water some of the good in her circumstances by leaning into this season of travel. That she could weed out some of the anxiety, that she could weave together something new with Frederico, that maybe they would actually get married and their gifts would complement each other in a coherent calling. So that's as we create. So listen, imagine, create. The last one is to communicate. How do we point people to Jesus with good news that connects in our context? And that's where we saw a story of the gospel, that Jesus is the great healer, that she needs healing to be a conduit of healing to others. So as we practice this, and maybe over coffee afterwards, you might even be open to sharing with someone that you can trust as to part of your own story as to what's that question, what's that Camino question for you, and how could you listen, imagine, create, communicate as Jesus journeys alongside you and as we journey alongside each other. Next slide, thanks. So just the last few things. This is something that may be helpful to you. A few of you saw that I was mentioning Reimagine is a course that we just released. It's entirely free, 5 sessions, and it basically teaches you how to do this. It's had rave reviews from Stu, who said that it was unsurprisingly excellent. A more muted review from Tash, who said it was surprisingly good. So make of that what you will. But basically, next slide, thanks, Cheryl. It teaches you how to do this triple listening, how to listen to the word, the world, and one another. Second last slide, next one. And it teaches you how to listen to what's going on and why, how to imagine what should be going on, how to create a change for how we'll respond, and how to communicate the good news of the gospel. It's the very last thing before we get back into sung worship. Final slide if I can. Thanks. I love this painting because it captures the dynamism of following Christ, but it also captures the confusion. At one point you're leaning in, at another point you're pulling away. And I think that reflects all of our hearts over Easter. We want to lean in, but there's also reasons that we pull back. My Camino journey had a strange ending because about 5 days in, we did the Hospitaliers route, which is a crazy day, and it was meant to be 33K, but it ended up being 35, 36 kilometers because we missed a shell. We were having such a great conversation, getting distracted, that we entirely missed a juncture, and we were just wandering along this path saying, isn't this a pleasant gradient? And then I said, I think we should be 200 meters higher than we are. And then we spent the next hour fighting through bush to try and reconnect to the path. And then 3 days later, my shin packed it in and I got shin splints and discovered that I couldn't simply stumble onward rejoicing. I was more just stumbling and there wasn't a lot of rejoicing. And I say that because each of us in our journey, sometimes at the hardest points, we fall, we get injured, we miss a path, we need to discern, we don't know where the shell is. And so maybe today you've actually come here, as you look at that question, you might be saying, actually, I have no idea where I am right now. I don't know where the shell is. I've lost the path. I don't know where the Camino path is. I've got an injury and I'm hurting. And so if that's you, we will have some people at the back who would love to pray with you. So maybe it's not just a matter of how do I discern, but maybe it's a matter of I need God to be able to do something special for me at the moment because I've lost the path. So if that's you, and if you're in the prayer team, please do make yourself known and available. But I'm going to pass back to Susie and to Tash now as we spend a bit more time in sung worship and finish our time. Thank you, Susie.